turn now to our first panel that will continue to explore this virtuous cycle that Congressman Sarbanes referenced. And so that panel is called The Pursuit of Happiness and Political Engagement. And I'd like to ask our panelists to join us on stage. And so while they're coming up, I'll go ahead and introduce this conversation. This conversation is going to explore the complicated interrelationships between mental health, agency, community, and political engagement, and invite all of us to think about ways that we can restore our own sense of purpose for our own health and for the health of our democracy. And so let me introduce our panelists. In the middle, we have Brett Q. Ford, who is a behavioral scientist and assistant professor at the University of Toronto, where she directs the Affective Science and Health Laboratory. Her research examines how people manage emotions and cope with stress, including the stress of politics, and considers both the benefits and costs of striving to feel good. Deb Roy, here to my left, is the director of the Center for Creative Communication at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He leads research in applied machine learning and human-machine system design with applications in understanding large-scale social media ecosystems and designing communication tools and social networks. And finally, we have Lilliana Mason, who is an SNF Agora Institute Associate Professor of Political Science, an expert on partisan identity, partisan bias, social sorting, and political polarization. She will be moderating this discussion. We very much hope also that this discussion is going to be an interactive conversation between the audience and the speakers. And so for those of you who are in the room, you can use the QR code, which is in the corner on the screen there, to submit any questions that you want online. And for those of you who are joining us online, you can just use the online portal to submit your questions there. And so welcome to all of you, and thank you again for joining us. And Lily, I'll turn the conversation over to you.
Great. Thank you, Hari. So just to provide a little more information about who I am, I'm trained as a political psychologist, so I study the political behavior of voters and people in the electorate. I particularly focus on American politics, but one of the cool things about political psychology is that it applies to all humans, right? Psychology is universal. So I'm hoping that we can have this conversation in a way that we can, using our research to explain politics across the entire spectrum of democracies. I'm going to get started with really just a sort of broad question for both of you so that you can introduce yourselves. And so I'm hoping that you can tell us just sort of more about what you do and how your work is related to the relationship between mental health or emotional health and democracy itself. Brett, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I am Brett Ford. It's nice to see you all here. I am a behavioral scientist, a psychological scientist, and I run a research lab where we're very interested in how people manage their emotions, especially during times of stress. And when you study stress, you go to where the stress is, and one place where stress is politics. And we're essentially starting to think that politics is a form of chronic stress for many people, right? It's just a kind of never-ending elicitor of negative emotions, kind of across the board. And we know from a long history of work on chronic stress that it damages health. And so we are very interested in trying to understand how people are feeling in the context of politics, how they're managing their emotions, how they're trying to protect their mental health in the face of politics, but also what the potential implications are when people focus on seeking comfort and potential trade-offs for engaging in collective action. And so that's where a lot of our work is.
Thanks. Deb?
Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here today. My background is I'm an engineer, and about 15 years ago at MIT, started work in analyzing social media at scale. Built a company in that space, ended up working at Twitter for many years as chief media scientist, and all that over a period of several years used social media as a channel to listen, to understand what was going on in the minds of people, in particular in the context of political events. And after the 2016 election, where we were involved in working with media partners like the Washington Post and the Commission for Presidential Debates to prep moderators with questions based on social media. Essentially, I and my team concluded that social media was this systematically distorted channel for listening. And we shifted gears to leverage the power of digital technology, including AI, digital interaction, to design new spaces that are optimized for listening, that are optimized for nuance, and the kinds of qualities that we just don't find in social media spaces. So what we do today is build tools and develop methods that are designed for community dialogue and listening. The kind of core of the approach is small group conversations with designated facilitators, prompts that we've been learning to design that open up conversations where people can share experiences rather than opinions, and then technology that makes it easy to, with the consent of participants, lift out parts of those live, face-to-face, or remote virtual conversations and share them between groups, and also at larger scale do what we call sense making, find patterns that connect conversations and make those patterns publicly visible. So we create sort of there's a publishing dimension to this to create a public kind of interactive feedback loop. And also we've been working primarily at a local level with cities, with media organizations, with youth-centered organizations in taking these patterns of people's experiences and translating them into civic action, making hiring decisions, inputs for policy, and so forth. So that's our work today.
Thank you. As scholars, I think sometimes we assume people know more than they necessarily do. So Brett, I want us to just start off with let's talk about the baseline information. What are emotions? How do they help us or harm us? How are they tools for us? And then how do those emotions relate to our political participation or our access to democracy?
So emotions are mental and bodily experiences, right? That we have that help us essentially kind of interact with our environment in ways that keep us alive, keep us in a functioning community, and so forth. And so we have emotions for pretty good reasons, and each of us has a repertoire of experiences that allow us to kind of interact with the world in useful ways. So an emotion like anger helps us confront things that aren't fair. Emotions like worry or fear help us avoid things that are threatening to us. Guilt helps us make amends. Happiness helps us make friends. And so we have these emotions. They provide us with important functions. Emotions, though, you might have noticed, some of them don't feel so good. Some are quite painful. And when we are having painful emotions, when we're having emotions that are very intense, when we're having emotions that don't quite fit the context at hand, it's really important that we have the ability to manage those, right? That sometimes we want to turn up the volume or turn down the volume. And so those abilities to manage our emotions are going to end up helping us protect our mental health and kind of respond to the world in ways that are useful to us, right? People have expectations for how we're going to feel and how we're going to express ourselves. And so while, if you accumulate a lot of negative emotions day to day, this is going to predict poorer mental health. If you accumulate a lot of positive emotions over time, this is on average going to predict better mental health. But that's not the full story, right? Because there's kind of a context for every experience, right? We want to be able to have those useful moments, those moments where maybe anger pushes us to do what needs to be done, where worry kind of helps us prepare for a presentation or an exam. And we can cultivate these experiences in ways that let us live kind of a fuller, healthier life altogether. Now, when it comes to politics, we know that in day-to-day life, politics is often inducing negative emotion in people. People are feeling outraged, people are feeling anxious, people are feeling sad, despair even, and doesn't mean that it's all negative. There are, if your candidate wins an election, you're going to be very excited, you're going to feel proud. So it's not only negative experiences, but those negative experiences, it's not all bad, right? Because we know that they're pushing people to take action, and so we find that actually one of the most consistent predictors of engaging in democracy, in demonstrating, volunteering, donating, contacting representatives, is feeling upset about something that's going on in the world, right? And those emotions are signaling to you that you want something to change, and they kind of push you to make change. And that's really powerful, and that's important, and we want to honor that. Now, when it gets so intense that it's hard to manage, people very understandably are going to want to feel better. And so when people use a variety of different tools, we each have different tools in our toolkits to manage our emotions, but some of the ones that are quite common that we're seeing in politics involve kind of opting out, right? Distracting yourself, or trying to think about the situation in a way where it's not that bad, we've been here before, we'll be here again, or we'll come through this on the other side, it won't last very long. These are things these are thoughts that we can bring into the mix that can help us feel better, right? If you don't think it's such a big deal, then you're probably not going to be very upset. But you're also not going to be motivated to take action. And so we're finding again and again that when people are really good at getting rid of those negative emotions, they're less involved. And so we're interested in trying to find ways for people to cultivate experiences that let them protect mental health while staying involved. And so emotions like compassion, inspiration, admiration, feeling social connection, these kind of socially connected and binding emotions, don't feel so bad. They don't elicit attempts to want to avoid those emotions. And they drive action and help people stay engaged. Now, unfortunately, those might not be as common as some of the other ones, right? And so we're trying to find ways to kind of turn up the volume on emotions that help people maintain their mental health while also staying active, and giving them tools to kind of sit with and manage those other emotions that they tend to want to avoid at all costs.
Thank you. I want to turn to Deb for a second. I want to actually have you put into context emotions in not just a political space, but online political spaces. And so, how has your work, do you think, tried to make space for healthier emotional engagement online, and particularly in political online contexts?
Sure. I guess one study I'll just mention briefly from our work that where we did do some emotional analysis. We published a paper in Science in 2018 where we did a comprehensive study of how true versus false news spreads across Twitter. And this was we did a comprehensive study of the entire, at that point, over a decade of Twitter's existence, and found, for example, these were fact-check stories from several different fact-check organizations, that if you looked at the retweet cascades of how a story that turned out to be true versus false spread, just as kind of one finding, that the story that turned out to be false would reach the first 1,500 users on Twitter 6 times faster than if it turned out to be true. And there's a variety of other metrics that showed this enormous difference between stories that were true versus false, according to these fact-checking orgs. We were not in a position to be able to unpack why, since this was an observational study, but we did look at all of the replies in how people responded to each of the stories, and we coded them for emotions. And what we found was that stories that turned out to be false had a statistically significant elevation of surprise and disgust as two emotions that were commonly expressed. And if you put that together with the context you're in, which is in a moment, you read something, or maybe you don't even read it. You just read the headline, or you read someone's rewriting of the headline and decide, for a variety of reasons, not necessarily thinking about the reliability of the information, should I share, that it seems that some of the emotions in the moment that are driving it, surprise and disgust, easier to be surprising and maybe disgusting if you don't have to stay close to reality, if you can just make stuff up. So in terms of online spaces, that's one study that we've done that speaks to the emotions. I'll just say maybe a word about what we're doing now, which is really in many ways a response to social media networks and thinking about small group dialogue as a different starting point rather than media, which is a broadcast mindset. If you look at every social media platform, they're designed to help certain people essentially create bullhorns and create large audiences. And it tends to invite the most extreme, polarizing voices to dominate. So if we start instead by saying, let's start with dialogue, and in particular within dialogue, and this is a kind of practice that has been rediscovered in dialogue practices throughout cultures over the ages, which is if you make this simple pivot and rather than ask someone, what is your opinion about guns? We were just talking about this earlier today. What is an experience you've had that brings you to that opinion? What's a personal experience that you've had that not only does that shift what you learn about a person, because it's no longer an opinion, which is often taken from somewhere else. But when it comes to the emotions and the impact on the listener, there's now a growing number of studies that show mutual respect, trust, empathy, all increase, even when what you hear in that story is clearly someone who holds opinions that are opposing yours. But facts and opinions can actually drive those factors down. So in a context where we find ourselves in social fragmentation that is increasing, that ability to create that foundation where you're able to enter into dialogue, into debate about different opinions, I think that kind of social fabric, there's very interesting interactions between the kinds of spaces we design, the emotions that they foster, interpersonal emotions that I think are important and not happening in general in social media spaces.
That's a really good point, thank you. I do want to think about taking a step back now, the implications of this for democracy, right? So there are certain, groups of people who have chronically more damaged mental health, for example. There are certain cohorts of people who are chronically anxious or chronically worried about just everyday life. And so to the extent that we have some populations who are in a different mental space, what does that say about representative democracy, right? Does that change who is in the Agora? Does that change who is actually able to make political decisions? And so for democracy as a whole, if we have some groups that are kind of more chronically challenged or that are more reactive to politics, how do we think about what does that mean for representation for democracy? What does that mean for the really truly potentially disturbing outcomes of how these mental health states change who is represented? Do you want to go for it?
Sure. It's a tough question. I wonder, I keep thinking back to our keynote speaker and thinking about suppression of voter registration, of voting, as being, to my mind, a very potent factor that's shaping who's in the Agora. In terms of mental health, there's not a huge relationship between in the work that I have seen, in the link between mental health symptoms and political engagement. And I think part of that is because you can see it kind of going either way, right? It's a complicated story. Maybe for some people, if you're so distressed, it's hard to even get out of bed. Are you going to vote? Probably not. For some people, that can be a very mobilizing experience. So it really kind of depends on the person. But in terms of us, if you're interested in a healthy functioning democracy, then you need a healthy functioning populace. Then mental health absolutely is part of the conversation in terms of what politics should be delivering to us. That should be a promise that politics is making and keeping for its people, that they're going to keep its people safe, and that includes physical safety, and it includes psychological safety as well. I do think that will feed forward, right? Because when people feel physically and emotionally, psychologically safe in their democracy, there's more buy-in. So it becomes that positive feedback loop. What we're currently seeing, though, is that there are people who are suffering and are still taking action. I mean, in often cases, the people who are suffering are the ones who have the most to lose and are often very motivated to change the status quo. So it's not a foregone conclusion that suffering means opting out of democracy.
Yeah, I guess I'd also go back to our keynote speaker and just this observation that the public sphere, when it's designed well, that you do feel welcome, you do feel respected, you do feel like you can engage. And when you don't, in that vacuum, the extremists will step in. And I have heard now from so many leaders, this is not only political leaders, but also in the workplace, that people are tired of creating public meetings, public squares, because they just get yelled at. That is the feeling from the leader's perspective. From the perspective of who shows up, these are highly performative spaces where you have to know how to take the mic, and with your 3 minutes, put your talking points, out there. And so I think that, and there's a very clear parallel in my mind in what has happened in many social media spaces. The same, the loudest voices, and so there's a sense of obligation to show up in these social media spaces, but be careful not to say anything meaningful because you're putting yourself at risk. So there's a kind of silence is safest, and yet you show up. So I don't actually know how to answer your question in terms of how it correlates with mental health, but we often use the phrase the underheard. And you can be underheard voices, underheard perspectives for many different reasons. But we talk about, among other things, the introverts, those who might feel safe in that private conversation to actually speak authentically. But that's the private sphere. Where is the public sphere where you can engage and what we sometimes create a brave space where I can decide how much of a calculated risk I take in entering into a space and sharing my story, sharing my perspective, sharing my opinions. So I think that unless we can create well-designed public spheres where people do feel that ability to enter, a lot of us will sit it out. And perhaps there's correlations with mental health in terms of who feels comfortable entering into those spaces. Maybe there's also correlations in terms of who does show up. Yeah.
Actually, I want to follow up on that briefly, which is when you talk about this sort of social media online space, it does seem like we've created new norms of how to interact politically online that are not what we would do in person. Right, very different from the way that we would interact in person. How do you change norms, right? How can you go into a space that's now existed for at least, a decade, more than a decade? How do you go into that space and say, okay, the norms you've created are harmful. They're attracting the wrong, they're attracting the most extreme people. They're not attracting people who are sort of quietly thinking about what types of policies they'd prefer. They're attracting people who want to yell. How do you create a new norm for online behavior?
Yeah, and I'd actually say that some of what we've been seeing, and I'll just be, I work at MIT, a workplace of 25,000 students, staff, and faculty, and we are experiencing the same thing in our community. We have open forums just for our faculty, 1,000 faculty, and if it's an open mic format, the same pattern occurs. So, and we've all read, well, I shouldn't say we've all read. In the US media, there's a lot of coverage of school board meetings at very local levels where it's just people showing up and shouting at each other. It's as if the norms that we have cultivated online have spilled into real life. It's not enough to turn off the phone. And again, it's in some ways no wonder, because most of our understanding of others are mediated. Each of us only has direct experience with maybe a few hundred people, and the rest is mediated. And much, for many people, the medium, it's hard to step out of it and reflect on, okay, what is my basis for thinking I know what this other parent or this teacher actually thinks? And it's all coming through this distorted medium. So I think there is a lot of kind of a feedback loop of a problematic kind in terms of behavior spillage. To answer your question, I think there has to be a kind of demand for something different. And I think that what we're talking about here today, a growing number of people feel it, have experienced it. I think there's a growing conversation that we need to do something about it. I'm somewhat skeptical of regulation of social media as the primary path. There's, in a US context with First Amendment constraints, there's a lot of constraints. But I think where there's a demand and then a positive, constructive vision that guides creative experiments for alternatives. That's a little self-serving, that's what I spend my time doing, but we need to create alternate spaces, and we know we can build scalable social networks. They don't have to be designed the way we've created. And we also know how to create hybrid technologies that can move between in-person and online. So, from my point of view, we should be building alternatives and experimenting. And also engaging on the civic education side in creating tools to reflect on, okay, where am I forming my beliefs? And can I step out? They say it's most difficult for fish to recognize they're wet, right? How do we step out and create those opportunities to reflect and see where our own beliefs are coming from? And maybe that's true of others as well, and that, along with creating alternatives.
Thank you. Brett, I'm going to ask you a similar question in a slightly different way, which is to move us from, as Deb said, talking about opinions to talking about experiences and perspectives, which allows us to have sort of more open, understanding conversations. How do we want to encourage these types of more sort of vulnerable interpersonal conversations? What types of emotional states allow us to be slightly more vulnerable with people, slightly more open, and therefore kind of more able to understand a different person's experience, able to understand how they came to the opinions they came to, generally kind of trying to walk away from this extreme combative language that we tend to have around politics?
Yeah, the $64,000 question. What is the answer, Brett?
4,000.
Well, Lily.
I'll take it for 4,000.
I'll take it. The first thought that comes to mind is that if we spent less energy trying to get rid of emotions, we would have more energy to be present and to listen to each other. One thing that can come up around tough conversations, and tough conversations happen when you're talking to people who you don't agree with, or when there's a contentious issue at hand, and it's going to bring up emotions for people. And that's normal, and that's okay. And rather than trying to get rid of those, because what's going to happen when you try to get rid of those, when your focus in that moment is, I'm really upset, and that is intolerable for me, and so I need to do something right now to kind of get rid of that, people are going to shut down, they might leave, they're going to disengage, they're going to try to minimize the distress of the other. There are a variety of kind of quick fixes that are very natural parts of our toolkits and work in other contexts and serve us very well. But in these moments where we're trying to make a connection with someone else who has a different perspective from us, it's not going to serve the goal of building that connection. And so I think one step would be in those moments to have a reaction to sit with those feelings. It's okay to feel upset when you've learned that someone else does something that you strongly morally disagree with, or someone has maybe hurt you, and that's okay. You don't need to get rid of those feelings. You don't need to minimize their hurt or distress. You can meet them where they are. Hopefully, of course, they're also doing this, right? This is an interpersonal exchange. And so if you leave space for that, then that allows other experiences to follow. Empathy, compassion, sympathy. If you're hearing a story, and this is a great question for Deb as well. If you're hearing someone's story and you can connect with them on a human fundamental level, you're able to maybe feel some admiration for them, some inspiration, some just like what they're feeling. I've been there too, and maybe you even feel pain for them, and that's the kind of pain that's going to build bridges rather than the pain that is going to create barriers. And so I guess, there's not like a very simple answer of, what emotion is gonna help solve everything. But I think one step is to not try to get rid of how we're feeling, to sit with, and then to allow yourself to have other kind of socially oriented experiences by having a connection with someone else that's authentic.
Yeah, I think it is a great question, and we sometimes talk about how do you create that airlock where for all this shouting and screaming, you can step into that space of calm and then be willing to be vulnerable. For us, a key factor just in doing this work, in the field, we've worked with organizations now around the US primarily, is it starts with finding partners that have trust with members of their community and are willing to essentially use some of that trust capital, if you will, to invite people into these conversations. And then it's critical that, for our work, that what is shared in those private conversations, that with the right consent, can gain more visibility. So we sometimes call it this intimacy gradient of being able to, through consent, move, and where voice can move at the speed of trust, a phrase we learned from one of our community partners. But it's that, these kind of locally trusted influencers who are able to invite people into conversation. So we tend to have people who come from the same enclave, so to speak. So there's more of a chance that what you share will be familiar to others in the conversation. Those are some of the factors that kind of create that space in our work.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, that what we need is both a trusted leader and for that leader to encourage more open, compassionate conversation, right? Not to actually actively discourage compassionate conversations.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, just a brief example. We were invited into this high school community in Maine where the trust had completely broken down between the school administration and the high school students. There had been some changes in policy in the school around diversity and inclusion. It led to a backlash that manifest as graffiti repeatedly with slurs in the bathrooms of this high school, and ultimately, out of just exasperation, the school administration locked all the bathrooms in the high school, but for 2 next to the principal's office. And in this kind of, I would call this a communication breakdown situation, we were invited in, and the key was, and just to come to one of our, I think, key themes here of democratic agency, it was the fact that the school administration was fine, they felt, I think, no choice, but to let the youth lead the process and decide which parts of their private conversations would be surfaced. And so that sense of agency and the trust of school leaders, high school students who invited their peers into conversations. And actually there was a lot of mistrust that what I say, I can't be sure, won't be heard by others. And so in this case, the students actually designed prompts where they demonstrated by starting off and saying something that was being recorded, saying something that their peers know they would never want administrators to hear, to kind of prove you can actually trust this space. And so that opened up a kind of dialogue that the bathrooms are now open. I'm happy to report.
Yeah. So I'm starting to get some questions. Before we turn to those, I do want to have you both briefly speak to how can we help the audience, both here and online, better understand how to healthily cope with the political environment, the sense of being overwhelmed, the sense of a lot of animosity involved in our engagement. How can we help people to cope with that, and by coping with it, encourage more participation, encourage more sort of broadly spread democracy in our communities and countries? Brett, you want to go first?
I think we've spoken, to try to knit things together, put a bow on it. There are forces at play that we know are going to make people want to disengage. It can feel really overwhelming. It can feel like the only thing that you can do is to just check out. And so the question is how to kind of keep people in that space while not jeopardizing their well-being. And so I think that one theme here is social connection and communication, and finding people with whom you can make that connection and have experiences that make you feel heard, that make you feel like you belong, that you're connected, that allow you to have this kind of, it's a buffer, right? I mean, social relationships are the most potent predictor of better mental health. It's just kind of, it's just known, and it's basically universal across the world. And so finding other people with whom you can make those connections and to channel those experiences into meaningful action, whatever that means for you. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to take to the streets. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to donate a bunch of money, right? Some people don't have the time or the resources to do things like that. Maybe it means that you think hyper-locally. Maybe it means that you are supporting someone in your community who's trying to make change. Maybe it's taking a moment out of your day to email your counselor about bike lanes, asking for a friend. So there are things that can be done that can cultivate those feelings of agency, that you do have something to contribute, because of course you do, and having that be part of a community where those behaviors are reinforced, you're building norms that we're all kind of acting in the service of our community, and then through those social connections, those are helping you feel more positive, they're helping protect mental health, and these are the type of cycles that we want to get ourselves into.
Yeah. I think my answer is actually very similar, and you said some of the same words that we even use. In our work, we use the phrase meaningful personal action to seek out opportunities where at a personal level I can act, so often that is local. Doesn't mean geographically local necessarily, but in my local community. And it's meaningful in that it connects to the bigger issues and the bigger picture, and yet it is something that personally is available to me. So I think seeking out those opportunities, that would be a recommendation to all. And for those of us who are in a position to do so, to create those opportunities, right? And it's really those two elements that, I guess in most general terms, is what I think matters.
Great. We've had a couple of questions here about happiness itself. And I'll use this particular one, which I think is really interesting. It says, in Greece, we have experienced sort of a demonization of happiness in life. Until recently, the focus was on work and political progress. Happiness was considered soft. Is there a way our political leaders can make happiness part of their political agenda? This seems especially important to younger generations who don't hear this from their elected leaders. The actual pursuit of happiness.
The pursuit of happiness, it is fraught. It's a hard question. I thought the question was gonna be like, what is happiness? And I was like, give me an hour and I will tell you. It's a complicated story. I mean, I wonder in this context if happiness is kind of a proxy for mental health and kind of emotional health and well-being, because that is also something that has been maybe not demonized in the U.S., but has been like derogated as less than. Like that's less of a worthy goal. Absolutely. I think we're starting to see people in positions of power acknowledge the importance of mental health, acknowledge that mental health is a public health issue, that it's a structural issue. I think there's a long history in many cultures of your psychological well-being being something that's inside of you and is your personal responsibility. But of course we know that our mental health is shaped by the structures and environments in which we live, and in that sense it is a shared and collective responsibility, and one that people in positions of power are stewards of, right? And so I'm starting to hear more from people in positions of power talking about mental health as a priority, as something we should be spending resources on, and they're the ones in the position to be sending resources there. And so, you know, it ends up being this interplay between the collective kind of clamoring for more and then people in positions of power being responsive to it. So in terms of what can be done, I think clamor. And then I would hope that the people who are in positions of power see the value in having, you know, the wellness of their community be a priority. I mean, it's a no-brainer for me, but I'm a psychologist, so I don't know if they'll listen to me. But if there's enough clamoring from everyone, then maybe it'll be heard.
Deb, we have a few questions just asking you how to explain how to create these deliberative spaces. Is it just about leadership, or is it about how the structures are designed overall?
This is in the context of the work we're doing?
Yeah.
You know, we look at it as almost like you might say, a two-sided marketplace. On one hand, the members of the community feel empowered in a highly decentralized way to control how their voice is surfaced, how it is interpreted. So you could call that kind of, sometimes we say bottom up, but it's really this decentralized community voice. And then institutional leaders, and that might be at a hyper-local level. It might be the teacher in the classroom, right? Or it might be the city manager that works in the city, that there's also a commitment to listen from the institutional leaders. And ideally, then this kind of two-sided marketplace, if you will, of a sort of demand and supply of voice, right? Just kind of structurally, ideally you have both of those that come together, and then it's the space in between where the design of that space is critical. And I think here, getting back to just the sort of key idea of this being a democratic space, if that space that structures the connection between members of community and institutional leaders that will make decisions that impact, if that space the control is centralized, I think that is a recipe for democratic backsliding and failure of democracy. That space, by definition, the public sphere, cannot be centrally controlled. So thinking about how we, again, as a technologist, I think constantly about the design of technology. So we're creating power tools or empowering tools that are easy for many people to use, as opposed to centralized systems that might be able to hoover up voice and synthesize, but critical is who controls that space and the process.
Just a follow-up on that is that some of the problems with the other more popular online spaces is that they are able to generate attention and revenue because of the sort of problematic engagement that's there. So how does something that's more compassionate, that's a better alternative, how does that compete with those spaces?
Yeah, I think I would just refer back to, we talked about a related question, which is, when I think about what gives me hope, it's number one, that there is growing recognition that we have a problem.
Yeah.
That our public sphere is distorted, it's unhealthy. I do see not just our work, I think there's a lot of now people thinking about how do we creatively build alternatives, that creating those alternative spaces and having the will to seek alternatives is important. And I think it's a mistake, whatever spaces we create for communication, to think about competing with social media platforms. Social media platforms, they're actually great for a lot of things. Number one, for entertainment. And with it, kind of spectacle, including political spectacle. You can't take your eyes off of certain things. And as an engagement platform in that sort of entertainment sense, they're actually phenomenal. And actually other forms of media, entertainment media, have become entangled in them. So I think competing in terms of number of eyeballs, number of people, et cetera, is a strategic error. But instead saying, where are places where civic processes that matter are happening? And can we intentionally use alternative tools and rules, we call them, right? You have to, it's not just about the technology, but it's how you actually use them, and weave those into those civic processes that are most consequential and form new habits. President Obama once used the phrase civic muscle. How do you grow these civic muscles, right? So I think the leverage, if you can bring them into, we helped Madison, Wisconsin hire their police chief, and in a very visible way, community voice that normally would not enter into performative spaces entered into that process. People felt empowered through that process. It was tiny in terms of eyeballs and number of impressions and all the metrics that I've actually worked on analyzing, within Twitter. Our effort was tiny, but in the city of Madison, for a consequential decision where the legitimacy of the search itself was challenged, I think a few hundred people involved in this kind of alternate social network had an impact. So that kind of, I think, search for the places of high impact and the will to integrate it. In the end, if there's not will, if there's not an actual demand, it doesn't matter what technology we create. But I think this addictive kind of spaces we've created, there is not, I wouldn't say that recognition is universal, but I was talking to a high school student in Boston just a few weeks ago who has made it his mission to travel around to junior high and middle schools and high schools around the city, and working with his teacher to just raise the alarm bell of what's happening with social media. And I asked him, so how do these kids react when you come and talk to their classes? And he says, well, in general, most kids know something's up. They know, they were born into these spaces and they feel something is wrong. It doesn't mean they know what to do about it. But to me, actually, that's a reason for hope, that people know something is not right, right? And so how do you then take that feeling, that emotion, that something's not right, and given alternatives, bring them in, not everywhere. I've got kids, teenagers, they use TikTok, it's entertaining, but they also have other spaces. But we have a lot of resources, we have a lot of scaffolding to create those alternate paths. But we can design technologies with nudges, with scalable scaffolding to create those alternate possibilities, if the will is there, which I feel is.
Yeah. This is a slight turn, but I really do want you to hear, and this might be our last question, but to what extent, I'm not sure if you can answer these questions, either of you, but to what extent can we understand what is behind hate speech? Like, what are the mental structures that encourage people to participate in hate speech online? And on the other side, what does it do to the groups that have been targeted? How does that affect the mental health of groups that have been targeted? So have we ever identified the kind of motivations for like the most poisonous speech online? And have we determined the outcome of that speech? Do we know?
Well, I was just thinking about my conversation with David Hogg before the session, so we should carry this question over, if we can, for someone who's lived it and in amazing ways engaged with, but behind the facade, what? I don't know how to answer that question in general. I think some hate speech, sadly, comes from people with deep-seated hate, but in other cases, but I suspect in the majority of cases, there is it's one part signaling, one part based on total caricatures of other groups that are distant, that are abstract, that have been dehumanized to a point where it's okay to send these threats. So those are, I guess, some off-the-cuff comments.
Nothing to add.
I don't want to speak beyond my my expertise. I have similar intuitions as Deb. Another angle I might add is that, unfortunately, a tool that we use to make ourselves feel better is to kind of make other people less than, right? And one really powerful way to do that is the spreading of hate and leveraging kind of tropes and words that are particularly hurtful. And I would hope that we could find alternative ways to help people feel okay with themselves than the need to spread that kind of, it's language, but it has very powerful visceral impacts on the community.
I'll add one other thing, which is, at the risk of talking about things I haven't studied clearly, but just thinking about the role of, again, the mediating technology, that I sometimes draw the analogy between how we behave often in hateful ways, in lobbing that toxic tweet or message across the internet. One of the things that makes it easy is the lack of not just consequences, but also the lack of even seeing the human reaction of how it lands on the other side. And that there's this paradox of this technology, the internet, social media, that has absolutely bridged divides. We are connected to people in ways that would have been unthinkable even a generation ago. And yet this same technology that brings us closer also creates this ability for division. And there's actually an interesting analogy to the car when you are stuck in traffic and you feel no lack of consequences in how you express yourself from the interior of your car. I live in Massachusetts, we call ourselves massholes, right? So this is a behavior that that becomes uninhibited when you are kind of in this protective shell. The fact that whoever sees your expression, or maybe of a threat or so forth, it actually has real impact. But we feel like we're safe, and we forget that there are human beings inside of those cars. We're just stuck in traffic. We forget we are traffic, that we're part of this. And so there's something about, again, the car brings us closer, lets us connect with people we otherwise wouldn't, and yet we enter this kind of behavior. So this lack of a feedback loop and the ability to forget you're dealing with a human being. And so we sometimes, again, another of our her sort of phrases that motivates our work is that seeing and hearing the humanity in others is necessary for democracy to function. And these technologies that create this extraordinary ability to reach at a distance also cut off that feedback loop and allow hate speech to go open loop.
Yeah, I mean, I would also add it allows hate to find hate, right? It allows people who feel hateful to find each other, particularly to kind of, that they find these spaces where they can actually let that simmer and grow together and lash out in that way. We are out of time. I want to thank Deb and Brett for helping us better understand the relationship between our emotions, our mental health, and democracy as a whole. I hope this was helpful for the audience here. And I want to hand it off to Hari.